Hello and welcome to Credible Faith, episode number 2, issue number 1 of Reader's Review. I'm your host, Paul D. Larson, aka Dr. Smalls. In today's episode, I will be looking at chapter 1 of Douglas Axe's book, Undeniable: How Biology Confirms Our Intuition That Life is Designed. And I want to give a word of warning or explanation to the reader before I dive in. Reader's Review is a mix of my paraphrasing, quoting, and commenting on material in a chapter, but it would be tedious for me to always specify when I am quoting an author as opposed to when I am paraphrasing or commenting on material. Thus, I may say some things as if they were my words when they are really the author's words and not tell you that I'm doing so. In those cases, it is as if the voice of the author and my voice are one. I do this for the sake of convenience and for making it easier for you, the listener, not to be distracted by my constantly specifying whose words I'm saying. I may still indicate at times that I'm quoting the author or someone else, but just don't assume that some words are mine merely because I don't preface those words with an explicit indication that I am quoting the author or someone else. Understood? Great, let's dive in. Before we get into the content of the chapter, if you don't know who Douglas Axe, the author, is, let me give you a little bit of information about him from the inside flap of the book. Douglas Axe is the director of Biologic Institute, a nonprofit research organization launched by Discovery Institute in Seattle. After his undergraduate studies at UC Berkeley and a doctoral work at Caltech, Axe held postdoctoral and research scientist positions at the University of Cambridge, the Cambridge Medical Research Council Center, and the Babraham Institute in Cambridge. His work and ideas have been featured in many scientific journals, including the Journal of Molecular Biology, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and Nature, and in such books as Signature in the Cell and Darwin Stout, and Life's Solution by Simon Conway Morris. If you would like to know more information, go to undeniabledesign.com. Okay, let's dive into the chapter's contents. Douglas Axe, in August of 2013, was in Cambridge, England, in a street called King's Parade, and he nearly collided with a British scientist, Sir Alan First. The two had somewhat of an awkward meeting in that particular case. Events had tested the friendship that they had, and from Axe's perspective, an honest conversation that made it clear where the two stood with each other and why their working relationship had to end so abruptly would have been very helpful back in 2002 when Axe left the Center for Protein Engineering. Axe had regretted the absence of that conversation, and he thought that maybe Alan did too. Initially, the conversation was somewhat awkward, or the encounter was, and Axe uses that as a sort of segue into another aspect of his life, and that is that Axe, for much of his life, has had a tendency to go against the flow, to go against the grain, and that has its own awkwardness at times. He gives an example from his time when he was doing graduate studies at Caltech, and he had a final exam, and the question on the final exam was this: which of the biological macromolecules is apt to have been the first living molecule? And the assumption behind that is one in regards to chemical evolution, and Axe doesn't really think that that is an adequate explanation for how biological macromolecules came to be. And so he had a choice at that time. Does he go with the flow or does he push against it? He knew what the standard evolutionary answer was, and he gave that answer, but he added a bit to it at the end, and he gave his own perspective after giving the evolutionary answer why he doesn't think that's actually convincing. And when he got his test back, he was docked for doing so. The point was that they were there, the students, not only to learn the answers, but to accept them without pushing back. To quote Axe, "We were there as much to be acculturated as educated." A remarkable comment by Axe, that we were there as much to be acculturated as educated. Now, awkwardness was not only something that applied to Axe's encounter with Sir Alan First, nor just to his issue of going against the grain for his final exam. Awkwardness also attended to Darwin's own proposal for the arrival of species. Darwin is known for survival of the fittest, but that doesn't explain how species came to exist. You need to have some mechanism for producing variation on which survival of the fittest would act. The idea of survival of the fittest itself really isn't that controversial. Those who are more apt or more fit would tend to have more offspring. That's something of a truism. But how could that truism, which is rather obvious, be a source of awkwardness? It in itself isn't. But the awkward part has to do with how species came to exist. It is something of an awkward proposal, the evolutionary proposal for the arrival of species. It's something that even Francis Crick admits, the scientist. Crick says, quote, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved, end quote. Notice that, constantly keep in mind. It's as if the things that we see in the biological world suggest that things have been designed. And Axe says this, if Darwin's claim is true, then it's a truth we all find ourselves doubting, at least subconsciously. And if it's false, then we're to be commended for doubting it. Awkwardness clings to it either way. Nice point. Darwin himself encountered some opposition to his proposal. In the first 5 editions of his On the Origin of Species, he had some paragraphs in which he noted that his theory wasn't accepted very well. Darwin says, quote, why, it may be asked, have all the most eminent living naturalists and geologists rejected this view of the mutability of species? And he also says, Darwin does, that he decided to, quote, look with confidence to the future to young and rising naturalists who will be able to view both sides of the question with impartiality, end quote. Darwin's particular view is that people are too close-minded. Now, things had changed when it came to the publication of the 6th edition in 1872. The 5th edition was published in 1869, and 1872 was the 6th edition. By that point, the tide had turned. Darwin was now in a position of many people accepting his proposal, and he had actually encountered pushback for including words from earlier editions of people not accepting his theory. It's as if scientists wanted the record to be expunged of their opposition to his theory. Listen to what Darwin says, quote, as a record of a former state of things, I have retained in the foregoing paragraphs and elsewhere several sentences which imply that naturalists believe in the separate creation of each species, and I have been much censured for having thus expressed myself. But undoubtedly, this was the general belief when the first edition of the present work appeared. I formerly spoke to very many naturalists on the subject of evolution, and never once met with any sympathetic agreement. It is probable that some did then believe in evolution, but they were either silent or expressed themselves so ambiguously that it was not easy to understand their meaning. Now, things are wholly changed, and almost every naturalist admits the great principle of evolution. What would cause that reversal of opinion? Was there some type of big discovery in the late 1860s or early 1870s that would have suddenly shifted the tide in scientific opinion? And there clearly wasn't. So why the change? Darwin's own words here reveal something of the fact that there is peer pressure in the scientific community, quoting Axe. If it's a plain historical fact that the experts didn't side with Darwin in the early 1860s, then why would he have been much censured, quote unquote, by his peers for saying so? It's as though his colleagues wanted all mention of opposition expunged from the record now that this opposition had faded. Darwin resisted the pressure applied to him on that occasion, but what if others, perhaps under even greater pressure, were less able to resist? Might the earlier inability of some scientists to express their support of Darwin's theory, the silence and ambiguity of expression Darwin referred to, have been the result of peer pressure too? And if so, then might the sudden change in Darwin's favor have been more like a change of power than a change of minds? End quote. What Axe is getting at here is the idea of peer pressure, of it being more a function of who's in power than of the scientific evidence. And the same thing may apply today. People are still people, whether they lived back in the 19th century or today. And if it was happening back then, surely it can happen today, can it not? There are numerous examples of scientific peer pressure existing today in the scientific community. And so just empirically, it is true that peer pressure does work. But that does raise the question, the evolutionary consensus in regards to the origin of life, how much is it due to the evidence, if at all? Or how much is it due to the peer pressure and the social forces that are at work within the scientific community of human individuals? Not everyone toes the line, though. And there are people like Axe who are willing to go against the stream and pursue the evidence where they think it leads, even if it means a significant social opposition or loss of scientific status in the scientific community. One of the persons who's actually willing to go against the grain is Thomas Nagel, a professor of philosophy at New York University and the author of Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Materialism, as Axe would define it, is the view that matter, the stuff of physics, underlies everything real. Those who would claim to be atheists would subscribe to a materialist point of view, and according to them, a belief in God is the product of human imagination or the human mind, which is itself a product of evolutionary forces. And those who believe in God, by contrast, would view all of the material universe as brought into existence by him. Atheists, Axe says, have a pronounced leaning towards scientism, which is the belief that science, he says, is the only reliable source of truth. And in that particular regard, if that were true, then religious people are basically making up a God who doesn't really exist. And that's a standard charge that is made against religious people, that they are sort of engaging in a Freudian wish fulfillment in regards to God's existence. The claim often made against religious believers is something like, you follow your heart more than you follow your head. You're not willing to go where the evidence leads, but you want the world to be a certain way, and so you basically believe in a set of religious convictions that make it so that the world is as you want it. Axe's view is that we should include the head along with the heart, and he does acknowledge that emotion can get in the way of clear thinking. But he sees this as a very general condition of humanity. And Axe says this, quote, "We would never offer it as a particular weakness of atheism, the way so many atheists offer it as a particular weakness of theism," end quote. This is a place where I actually disagree somewhat with Axe, and I disagree on both empirical grounds and on biblical grounds, being someone who believes in what God has revealed. Let's start with the empirical grounds. I'm going to quote here from G.K. Chesterton's book, Orthodoxy. If you don't know who G.K. Chesterton was, he was one of the most well-known writers of the 20th century, one of the best writers, in my opinion, of all of English literature. And listen to what Chesterton says, quote, "Modern masters of science are much impressed with the need of beginning all inquiry with a fact. The ancient masters of religion were quite equally impressed with that necessity. They began with the fact of sin, a fact as practical as potatoes. Whether or no man could be washed in miraculous waters, there was no doubt, at any rate, that he wanted washing. But certain religious leaders in London, not mere materialists, have begun in our day not to deny the highly disputable water, but to deny the indisputable dirt. Certain new theologians dispute original sin, which is the only part of Christian theology which can really be proved. Some followers of the Reverend R.J. Campbell, in their almost too fastidious spirituality, admit divine sinlessness, which they cannot see even in their dreams. But they essentially deny human sin, which they can see in the street." End quote. Chesterton's idea is that the doctrine of sin, the doctrine of human depravity, is an empirically verifiable one. We can look at the evil in the world around us and see that this is true, the doctrine of total depravity and of sin, but we can also look inside of us, into our own hearts, and if we're honest, we would see sin there as well. In light of that, what is man to do if he lives in a world in which someone says that God exists and God has certain demands of how you are to live, and those demands go contrary to how you're currently living? What are you to do? Well, one thing you can do is let your heart lead and your mind take a back seat and say, well, God does not exist, and that way I can just get to continue living as I want to. And actually, that makes quite a lot of sense, just looking at it empirically. I would want to go beyond that and look at it from a biblical perspective, and I would say that the biblical perspective goes contrary to what Axe says in this particular case, and that is that man does suppress the truth of his knowledge of God. Look at, for example, at what the Apostle Paul says. "For the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse." According to Paul, men know that God exists and they can see it in creation, but they suppress it because of their wickedness. They want to live in a certain way. They don't want God to exist, and thus they act as if he does not, even knowing in their minds that he does. Now, this is an idea that is actually admitted by some people, and Axe goes on and he gives a quote of someone who actually does admit it. So the fact that Axe actually does include someone who admits this basic idea may be an indication that actually Axe and I don't really disagree all that much. Axe quotes from Thomas Nagel. Here we're getting back to Nagel. And Nagel rejects the simplistic scientism that many so-called atheists would cling to. And he basically admits that his heart is leading his head. He says this, quote, "I want atheism to be true and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and, naturally, hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. My guess is that this cosmic authority problem is not a rare condition, and that it is responsible for much of the scientism and reductionism of our time. One of the tendencies it supports is the ludicrous overuse of evolutionary biology to explain everything about life, including everything about the human mind." End quote. And so here we have a case of someone who is a secularist basically admitting that his heart takes precedence. We all face the question of to whom or to what do we owe our existence? And this is what Axe calls the big question. It's the question that he names the chapter after. And Axe says this about the question of to whom or to what do we owe our existence. Quote, "This has to be the starting point for people who take life seriously. Scientists and non-scientists alike, we cannot rest without the answer, because absolutely everything of importance is riding on it. To know where everything came from is to know where we came from, and where we came from has everything to do with who we are, and who we are has everything to do with how we ought to live." End quote. So Axe here is coming basically to the idea that I brought up earlier. The answer to the question, the big question, to what or to whom do we owe our existence, has very tangible implications for how we are to live our lives. If a man is committed in his sin and does not want to live in the way that he would need to live if the Bible were true, then he has very strong heart commitments that would cause him to say with his mouth, God does not exist, such that he can live with his heart in a way that he has always lived and continues to live. That brings us to the end of the first chapter, except for a sort of map that Axe gives us. So if you want to know what I'll be covering in some of the next Reader's Review segments, when I'm looking at more of Axe's book, continue listening. Axe indicates that in chapter 2, he would introduce the intuition that creates internal conflict in all of us, and that goes against Darwin's claims, and he calls this the design intuition. Chapters 3 and 4 would be a short account of the unexpected lessons that Axe learned while seeking a scientific solution to that conflict. And interestingly, they aren't actually lessons primarily about the proteins or the science that he was studying. They are lessons about people he interacted with on the way, and more broadly about people in general. In chapter 5, we would see that the answer isn't to be found in technical science, the level that Axe has engaged in, but something that's much more familiar, something more democratic, what Axe calls common science. His point would be that mastery of the technical science isn't needed at all in order for us to know the answer to the big question. Basically, you don't have to have Axe's PhD in order to have an answer to that question. And in the next section of the book, chapter 6 through 9, would be a journey through some important aspects of that common science. Chapter 6 would provide a better understanding of what life is and isn't. Chapter 7 would give a common science refutation of the idea that natural selection explains how all of life came to be. Chapter 8 would be an exploration of searching, showing that many inventions needed for new life forms to evolve would have had to be found accidentally. But chapter 9 then indicates that invention can't actually happen that way, accidentally. And that's just to confirm what Crick wanted us to suppress, the design intuition. In chapter 10, we would look at the question of what life is again, and this time he would look at it through the lens of invention. Chapters 11 and 12 would consider carefully the question whether something was overlooked in rejecting the evolutionary explanation of life, and would ask whether the scientific community's defense of evolution is more like a science thing or something that more has to do with the culture. Chapters 13 and 14 would examine the nature of life and humanity more deeply, and Axe would also look at what he would hope science would look like in the future. That gets us to the end of Axe's chapter. If it sounds interesting to you, go out and buy it and read it for yourself. I'm just doing a paraphrase and quoting and commenting on the book itself, but if you want it straight from the horse's mouth without me getting in the way, go buy the book yourself.